Hello, everybody. Welcome back to The Common Law. I am your host, Attorney Edward Berkman. My guest and I this evening are both attorneys. We, however, are not your attorneys. So please do not take anything that we say here as legal advice. We are simply just going to be talking about a specific law. We are by no means experts in this law. This law is going to be brand spanking new, and there's going to be a lot that has to go into vetting the policies and the procedures that will need to be taking place to enforce these laws. So again, we're just two gentlemen having a conversation about this. Please do not consider any of this legal advice. Tonight we have a very special guest. This is our first returning guest. I'd like to introduce once again to the common law my friend and colleague Brian Murphy. Brian, how are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. How are you, Ed?
We're doing well. Celtics have started
3-0.
Off to a good start.
3-0. Let's try for 4 tonight.
Yes, and so at some part about being a lawyer is you have to keep on top of the law, and when new laws come out, it's your responsibility as an attorney to keep yourself abreast to those changes. So Brian, you were on a few months ago, and we were talking about estate taxes.
Correct.
And a lot of things we were talking about dealt with what we would call that sort of $1 million threshold. So if you passed away, and correct me if I'm wrong or if I miss anything, when you pass away, you would go ahead, and if your gross estate was over $1 million, you would have to pay something of what is known as an estate tax. So let's just remind everybody what is exactly an estate tax.
Yeah, sure, Ed. So an estate tax is basically any assets that you own or have in trust. Upon your passing, the value they are on your date of death is included in your estate. So a house, a bank account, life insurance proceeds on your name, retirement account, anything that you have in your name as an asset in your estate, most of that probably makes sense to people. A lot of people are often go, life insurance, that's, tax-free, I thought. It's income tax-free, but it's part of your overall estate. They basically look and say, oh, you were worth X upon passing. If it's over a certain amount, they're going to charge you a percentage of that as a tax.
And we were talking before about basically any gross estate over $1 million would then be subject to that estate tax, like we discussed. And then there was something called this fiscal cliff. So even if you were like $1 over, well, now you're being taxed on your full gross estate for the full $1 million and $1,001 in that example.
Correct. Yeah, Massachusetts we called the cliff effect. You basically the moment you hit over $1 million, everything was included. Like you said, it wasn't just a percentage of the excess; it was the whole thing.
Okay. So that was then. Let's talk about now.
Exciting times, Ed. For the first time in over 20 years, there's been sweeping tax change in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. As part of that, one of the things changed was the estate tax.
Now, before we go into the details on this, weren't we pretty close to this again a few months ago?
Months is about a year now. Time flies. But yes, last July, they were about to, this was on their desks down at the, State House. And then they allowed, they proposed and passed sports gambling and sidelined this for a whole year. So,
well, priorities, right?
Yeah. They delayed it, but they got it done. It took another year, but they got it done.
So that, my understanding is, looking at this sheet that you provided me here, we were looking at the House Bill number 4104, and that was signed into law on 10/4/2023. So about a month from when we're recording this. So without further ado, Brian, let's jump into what you would perceive to be the biggest change from this law.
Well, so the biggest change from this law, and maybe it's just bias on what we do, is the estate tax changes. We, as the state, decoupled from the federal exemption back in 2000, I believe, 1999-2000, and it's been stuck at that $1 million for just over 20 years. And with this change, we have doubled to $2 million for an estate tax limit, exemption threshold, and included with that limit is a credit that gets rid of that fiscal cliff. So now it is your first $2 million are subject, estate tax free, and it's only the dollars over $2 million that are taxed. There is no fiscal, estate tax cliff, so to speak.
So essentially, the limit has doubled.
Correct.
So now, for folks at home, if your estate is now over $2 million, you have to file an estate tax return. If you're over that million and hadn't reached that 2 million yet, you do not need to file an estate tax return.
Correct.
This is huge.
Big changes. Big changes. And, a little twist is it's retroactive to January 1st of 2023. So we have clientele who they were preparing an estate tax return. Parents died in January. It was due in October. Well, now we have to call them up and say, state laws have changed. You're off the hook. The estate wasn't 2 million, but it was over 1. So now you're good to go. So, if you know someone who's in the process, tell them that they might be off the hook, or it's definitely less, of an amount owed.
We don't know really exactly why they changed this, but I think it's safe to say that with the real estate values being so high, so many people were just hitting that $1 million exemption. So
yeah, people were becoming house poor by inheritance. Someone inherits a house that in this area of the state, Eastern Mass, it's worth $1 million. Well, now you somehow have to pay a tax, but you have no cash. It's all in the house, so you're forced to sell the house. So this really helps you from being house poor on an inheritance, essentially. You can.
So I think a trick some people were using when they were thinking they were going to be above this $1 million exemption. So if a married couple thought they were going to be over, well, maybe they go ahead and file separate tax returns. Does this law still allow for that sort of loophole to take place?
So what you're discussing is the law that was voted on last election cycle, which allowed us to change the Mass Constitution. So that's an income tax change. So if you earn, currently the Mass income tax is 5%. Every dollar over $1 million starting this year is going to be an additional 4%, so 9% total. There was a potential loophole where you could do married filing jointly, for example, federally, but for Mass, you did married filing separately, and that way you could split your income so neither of you went over $1 million. Now, there is language in here that says you have to file the same in Mass as you did federally, trying to get rid of that loophole, so force those people with over $1 million in income to file.
Okay, so that, folks, is a little different. That's the quote-unquote millionaire's tax, not the state tax.
Yeah.
So two different taxes that have pretty thoroughly changed with this new law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other changes to the estate tax law that we should highlight?
So, we're still reviewing the law. Just because it's written into law doesn't mean it won't get tweaked or, revised, so to speak.
Yeah. So, folks at home, laws are often interpreted by what we call case law. So, somebody will challenge something that'll go against or someone will bring about a lawsuit. It'll go up to the, state Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And
the appropriate courts, whether it went against a tax review board or something like that to determine, this isn't fair, this is fair. There's always a chance someone challenges it, but...
So then it would be just more... Not necessarily changed, but just interpreted maybe slightly.
Yeah, so what'll happen is you'll have tax preparers and attorneys interpreting this the best way they can see fit. And then if their interpretation doesn't mesh with the Department of Revenue or the state legislature, then, everything's great on paper, but life just has different variables.
Yeah.
So
everybody at home, just take everything we're saying with a grain of salt here. We're just literally going over the black and white pages of the bill.
That's less than a month old.
It's exactly. So there's a lot of legal, working out that still needs to be done here for this. And we're really not sure exactly how it shakes out, but just for the rest of the conversation here, we're just going to kind of tackle the black and white of the bill.
Absolutely. And so one of the things in the bill, again, it's in our field, we're discussing, interpreting. It seems as though they're looking to try and include out-of-state assets in your Massachusetts estate tax. And what I mean by that is, before this new tax law was written, let's say that you had $800,000 of assets in Massachusetts and $400,000 outside of Massachusetts, maybe a vacation home up in New Hampshire or something like that. You didn't have to file an estate tax because your Massachusetts assets were under that $1 million. The $400,000 doesn't count. It was deemed in a court case years ago unconstitutional by the Mass Constitution to include it. Now, the way this new law is written, it seems as though they do want to include those assets to calculate your total estate. they're not going to exactly tax those assets, but they want to tick you over the limit. So now the exemption is $2 million. Let's say your mass estate is worth $1.5 million, and you have another $1 million in a property outside the state. They're going to combine those to make your estate now be over $2 million. So you have to file an estate tax return. The percentage of the assets outside of the state, they won't tax. So if it's 30% outside of the state, 40%, they'll reduce your estate tax by that percentage. But you went from not having to file a return at all to they're going to make you file one, and then they're going to argue, well, we're not, taxing you on what's outside of the state, so it's constitutional. Will that go through in the end? I don't know. That's how it reads, though, in the new laws, what they're going to try to do.
Interesting. Okay, so if you owned like a house, like your example, a house in New Hampshire,
Right.
so you're not being taxed on that property in Massachusetts. It's more so it just pushes you up over this exemption limit. So now you have to file an estate tax.
Correct.
Interesting.
That's how we're reading it right now, as it stands on paper.
I mean, it's a pros and cons to that. I mean, the $2 million is a huge victory.
It's a big jump. Completely doubled.
Losing that fiscal cliff, I think, is a big victory.
Absolutely.
So having to give a little bit back on what might be a subset of the population that has, large assets outside the state. They're not. In that example, chances are you probably would have had to pay an estate tax under the old system anyway.
Yeah.
So this is probably, unless you own a vast majority of your.
Yeah, you have everything outside. You just have a little house here in Mass, but you have all these vacation rental home. Everyone's different, right? Some people do have that conglomerate of rental property.
So I mean, give and take.
Yeah.
I mean, it is what it is. Mm-hmm. So that's not so bad. Any other changes that we want to highlight here?
There's a lot of other changes that don't involve estate tax. One that I think is, personally I've experienced when coming through as a student here in Massachusetts, and I know affects so many people in the state, is the rental deduction in Massachusetts. It used to be a $3,000 credit. Now it's up to $4,000. It's only going to get you, I think, roughly $50 of an extra refund in Mass. So they could have done more with it, in my opinion, especially with how, rent is nowadays. $4,000 credit, you spend that in 2 months on an average rent sometimes here.
Rent.
So I feel like they could have done more, but that's a big one that does help some people. Deductions on MBTA and commuter expenses have been increased slightly as well. There's different things to help people. I think they could have done more, especially with such a surplus. The state had to give us all refunds last year. They're definitely not hurting for money, I don't think.
Do you think a lot of these are maybe just adjusting for inflation or just adjusting for like rental market?
I would say that's probably a good piece of it. That way they can say, look, we're giving back to the people, see what we're doing, it looks good, and it's quicker fixes too. And that's why most of what's done is effective back to January 1st, 2023. Like I said before, just like the estate tax, because all it takes for them is let's update a couple calculations, maybe a couple lines on the tax forms. It doesn't take big overarching changes. There are a few things in here that affect more in terms of corporate and financial institutions. Those aren't effective until 2024 or at latest 2025. But that's because the Department of Revenue is going to have to make new forms, have new issue how it works and things like that. And so the stuff that takes longer, they just can't have ready by next January 1st.
Gotcha. Yeah. So this is brand spanking new, and it seems like not real big game changes here. Just sort of adjusting some. Absolutely. Limits and some deductions.
Absolutely. There are some fun ones in here as well. Increases the cap on the state dairy tax credit from 6 to 8 million. So I'm assuming your local farmers and people like that who still do dairy in the state of Mass will benefit. One that I chuckle at when I read is they increased the maximum amount of alcohol that ciders and still wines can contain from 6% to 8.5%. And I'm assuming it's because they probably get a little more tax on the percentages. I'm not super familiar with the alcohol tax law there.
That is very interesting.
But it's interesting. I'm reading. It's like numbers, alcohol percentage. So
yeah, that's an interesting
one of those throw-ins there you don't expect to see. I'm trying to see what else I had a few of these highlighted before. I don't have the number in front of me. I'm failing. Oh, the senior circuit breaker credit. that helps, senior citizens stay in their homes, especially, again, you don't want, if you have low income levels, just Social Security or something small, so your income level is low enough, but you have high real estate tax. The goal is to keep you in your home. It was $750. They've increased it to $1,500, and then it's adjusted annually for inflation as well. After adjustments, I guess the credits essentially give you $1,200 up to $2,400 back.
Okay.
The way the numbers work, I know I'm saying a lot, but point is they've doubled the senior circuit breaker credit, so that's helpful for again, seniors on a fixed income in Massachusetts. It helps them, on the Massachusetts side of things. And then I think there's a few other, they've increased the disabled adult, dependent children. They've increased that tax credit in Massachusetts as well. Obviously, there's the federal one, but Mass, they've gone from 180 to 310. And one of the big numbers, and again, I'm blanking here, is they've increased some of the septic credits as well, if you're updating your septic system and things like that. Because, the price of a septic replacement is now so
high.
high.
Everything related to real estate is just so expensive now.
Absolutely.
So it's a good. So we're moving in the right direction. I think a lot of times we were talking about the estate tax last time was like Massachusetts was tied for like the lowest.
Them in Oregon.
Yeah, them in Oregon, right?
Yeah.
So it's encouraging that we're at least as a state moving a little bit more modern.
Right.
Keeping up with other states, and so it's kind of on the same level as everybody else. We're not sort of being penalized by being in Massachusetts. Yeah. I think, especially when it comes to estate tax, this is just simply conjecture, but I think, you see some people maybe moving out of state to avoid having to pay these penalties. Yeah. I move to a state like Florida that doesn't have an estate tax,
Yeah, Florida, New Hampshire, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're here in Newburyport. New Hampshire is like 5 miles away.
Right. Yeah.
So
just a little bit of geography, and all of a sudden there's no estate tax.
Yeah,
right?
And it could be a massive savings.
Yeah.
And this is stuff you're giving to your kids. This is stuff you're leaving behind for your legacy. You don't want to have to pay upwards to 30% of your estate.
Yeah, it can definitely, usually it's anywhere from 8 to 16% on the Mass side, but obviously if federal kicks in as well, then that's up to 40 on that side. So it really depends on the size. But
so while I got you here, let's talk about the federal exemption.
Sure.
So that's a big number. I'm sure you have it on top of your head. But
$12,900,000 and change right now per person.
And that is set to sunset fairly soon, right?
January 1st, 2026. It'll go back to pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act
which would be around $4 to $6 million adjusted for inflation.
So it was $5 million and change, not counting inflation, but they've said that they will count inflation that has been accruing since 2017. So we think it'll be approximately in the $6 million per person range.
Okay.
So it's at $12.9 million now. If it's down to 6 and change, basically cut in half. Not a lot of people have the $12,900,000, but cutting it in half does affect more individuals. You never know. As it's about to sunset, Congress might come and say we extended another 5 years. So it's hard to tell. We're going to go off the assumption that they won't, just because they often drag their feet. But you never know. You never know.
Now, with this new $2 million exemption in Massachusetts, that should make everything easier in terms of buying and selling homes. You're not going to need as many 65Cs.
So the 65Cs, I think, we'll still need. That's just someone saying, my parents don't have an estate that was worth $2 million. We just don't have to file as many release of liens with the Department of Revenue instead. It should make the process a lot simpler, a lot smoother. Just again, that extra $1 million is a big cushion. It's one thing when people are like, $950, is it really? You don't know the value of a house, but you have that extra $1 million. I think the only thing, outside of just getting rid of the estate tax altogether, I really enjoy the $2 million, that extra increase. I think the one thing if they could have done would be let it index for inflation like the federal side. So, next year it's 2,100,010, and you just, you can do that, so that way it doesn't always stay stagnant because, in 10, 20 years, 2 million might be low. It's hard to tell. That'd be the one thing I'd love to have, but
run into the same problem we already ran into where they set it at $1 million, they didn't adjust for inflation.
Right.
Time goes by, all of a sudden $1 million isn't what it used to be.
Yep, but I guess that's a problem for someone down the road. We'll kick the can out. I'm happy with 2 now. It's definitely a good change.
Absolutely. Well, this has been super, super insightful. I hope everybody appreciates Brian's time as much as I do Thank you so much for coming on and explaining this to us. This is, like I said, folks, this is big. This is really important stuff to keep track of. And if you have any tax questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to him. His email should be found at the bottom of the screen right now and throughout the rest of the episode as well. So definitely jot that down. Write him an email. Ask him a question. Same thing with me. If you'd like to contact me instead, I'll get you in touch with him. But fantastic information. This guy knows his stuff when it comes to tax law. So real important stuff. But anyway, thank you, Brian, for being my guest this evening.
Anytime.
And thank you, everybody, for joining the Common Law. Come back next week, and we'll discuss another legal topic. Probably not as juicy as this one, but it'll be something. All right, everybody. Have a good night.